Now on BBC Two, the net enters the real world of virtual reality.
In the net tonight, Martin Jakes explores how the internet is changing our ideas of community and national identity. From the US, a special report on how virtual worlds can be more fun than the real thing. In our weekly hot list, Sadie Plant searches for alternative identities in cyberspace. And Benjamin Woolley introduces us to VRML, a new modelling language which promises to give the internet the 3D treatment.
We're approaching a condition in which our communities are partly physically defined and partly virtual. What I'd expect to see is a movement towards a structure where there's less physical movement of people around the urban fabric, more nucleation of small-scale local communities, but within those local communities, connection to the big wide outer world, to communities of interest electronically.
The net is global but American, American but global. If we want to understand the philosophy, the strategies for cyberspace, we have to talk to Americans or those based in America, even though its ramifications affect us all. America is at the forefront of digital technology. Europe and Japan are still very much secondary players in all this. As we travel across Europe, a continent of multiple identities and communities, we have to ask, how is all this likely to affect us?
I participate, as many other people do, in both locally defined physical communities and very important online communities, communities of interest that make up a really vital part of my everyday life. It's important to recognize in thinking about this that it's not an either-or situation. I think in the future what we're going to need are our local physical communities and our online virtual communities.
That sounds like a plausible, if perhaps a little optimistic vision of the future. At least it avoids the worst forms of cyberbabble, which suggests that somehow the online revolution is about to transform our culture and our communities, rather like San Franciscan hippie talk of the late 1960s. It also makes a refreshing change from the way British politicians, from John Major to Tony Blair, talk about community. You know, village greens and warm beer. We all know that those kind of traditional local communities are in decline, and we're witnessing the rise of communities of choice and interest. Perhaps the net offers new possibilities for these kind of communities.
What it does is to transcend space. And that's an interesting conception of community, because our older conception of community is very, I think, tied to the notion of localities, people living in face-to-face contact with one another. That's what we mean by communities all huddled together, as it were. Actually, of course, there have always been communities which are much wider than that. One's always shared things with people with whom one doesn't live face-to-face. One shares musical taste with people on the other side of the world, etc. And increasingly, because of the media anyway, it seems to me, those communities of choice, communities of taste, communities of interest, have been growing, what we call symbolic communities, have been growing alongside the communities of space and residence. And I think the internet and all that's associated with the new information technology sort of expands in a multiple way the possibilities of sharing conversations across these different divides.
I think it allows existing groups of people around the world with common interests to communicate quicker. But I don't think that it creates those communities. If I'm a stamp collector and I want to talk to other stamp collectors around the world, I can do it very fast through the net, and that's wonderful. My common interest with a stamp collector in New Zealand is the same. The net doesn't create any new important political issues in and of itself.
Isn't that a rather narrow view of what matters in our culture and what politics is? After all, 30 years ago, we would have dismissed those who were concerned with the future and well-being of the whale as apolitical. But in any case, the net isn't just concerned with new communities. It's also about some of the oldest of them all. For example, a sense of national belonging.
PaddyNet is an Irish-themed entertainment and information site on the World Wide Web. We'd like it to be the place on the internet where Irish people and those people who are interested in Irish entertainment and culture and music and arts and so on will be able to go to see what's happening in those areas. Well, why don't I show you what it looks like. We've got 4 main sections. We have a contemporary arts section which is divided into music and visual arts and writing and so on. This is the section that we call the Island, and this deals with Irish mythology and history and literature and landscape. We started out with a feature about Newgrange, which is an ancient burial site in Ireland. It's actually older than Stonehenge. This is the really interactive part of PaddyNet. There's also a chat line where people from, no matter where they're located in the world can talk to each other in real time over the web. And in fact, there's a lot of Irish spoken too.
I mean, I can understand that you've got the arts, you've got the entertainment, you've got the connections, but why the history?
Because I think that's what provides Ireland or Irishness with its identity. I mean, it's with Irish people with their common heritage. Now, what technologies like the internet offer is the facility for a global community to contribute and fashion the future of Ireland.
Here we are in a very traditional manifestation of the worldwide Irish community, an Irish pub in Brussels, of all places. PaddyNet, of course, is quite different. And yet, it's really about the same kind of thing, organising and representing an existing community. But does every community have the potential to use the net in this kind of way?
Communities that have been locked into their own histories, their own economies, their own cultures, and can only reach out because when they have access to alternative models, can gain access to models through the conversations which the internet facilitates. So I think in that sense it builds, if I say global consciousness, global doesn't mean that there are no differences between these different communities that are speaking, but it does connect across globally communities that have been previously, I think, very much confined by space.
Now, if the net is about creating new identities and new communities, then it should be made for Europe. Imagine a Europe in which every citizen is online. Is there a European vision for the net?
It's a vision of, like we call it, the information society. It means to give the future on 2 sides, where you will have a national and a traditional culture, and you will have a European culture.
Will the net make us feel more European and less attached to our national identities?
I think you have 3 levels in the future. You have your national level, and you have a European level, and then you have a global level on top of it. And we have to discuss what it means. It doesn't mean it won't change your attitude, and it won't change your thinking, and it won't change the way you want to live or your lifestyle. Of course this will happen.
Ignore the cyber waffle. The technology is not going to deliver us into some brave new world. But be sure something fascinating is happening here, which is going to profoundly affect our culture and our communities. It's only the beginning, but it is surely the beginning of something big.
Digitally generated virtual worlds are becoming ever more sophisticated. They can now be populated either by lifelike automata or by avatars, representatives of actual humans online. And the creators of these worlds, their gods, are looking towards boundless horizons.
When humans begin to make computer simulations in little universes and begin to act as gods themselves, they discover that there's all kinds of ways to be God. And one of the ways, the most obvious ways to create a world is to make little characters, to kind of form them through code, and to release them into the world that you've made, and let them go and be themselves, and see what happens.
The very simple patterns that you see don't look like they have much interesting activity to them, but as you run them, the various patterns turn into different types of things. You could, for instance, have an ecosystem where the cells are either wolves or sheep or grass, and the grass just basically tries to spread to neighboring cells. The sheep move around grazing through the grass, and so if you're a wolf and if you see any sheep neighboring you, then you go ahead and eat those sheep. Now, what's interesting when you look at what happens once creatures acquire a culture and a way to communicate is that they can start talking about survival strategies, and then you start getting the ability to change your survival strategies very often. So effectively, you have a system that's 1,000,000 times faster than Darwinian evolution. In Mindshare, it's a model of people trying to live in a primitive environment. Each of them has a different strategy for survival, and they can walk up to each other and talk about their strategies. This is really just to illustrate that there is a language engine underneath that allows them to communicate. This isn't a canned script. Every time you run this, you get something different.
We have worlds where most of the beings are sim beings, or little tiny automatons. They're incredibly dumb. When humans go and try to enter those worlds, and humans want real people. They want the intelligence and surprises that only human intelligence can offer right now.
Well, the basic idea we started with was we didn't know how to create an automaton, a robot, that was as rich and as real and as expressive and as believable as a real person. So what we said is, we won't even try. We'll just use this interesting new technology to connect real people to each other. Basically, everything in the design is driven by a simple principle, which is, does it promote interaction between the people in the world? We've put in all kinds of different ways for people to express themselves, both in their appearance and in terms of various gestures that they can make with their body. And of course, by talking. Actually, what the customers do is type on their keyboard, and the words that they utter appear over their avatar's head in a balloon, rather like a comic book or a comic strip character. The world contains an economy based on a unit of currency which we call the token. People are given a certain number of tokens for every hour they spend online as an inducement to stay online, and with those they can buy various things in vending machines that are located throughout the world.
If you happen to make a world, as some have made already, where the only way to acquire things is to buy them, to purchase them, already made from some vendor, what happens is that the worlds are fairly constrained, and they seem to be very boring.
When building a virtual world, all of the architects, all of the builders' assumptions and beliefs about the way the world works are fundamentally built right in there. There's no masking. So you can't hide your ideologies even a little bit when you're building virtual environments. It helps a lot to be grounded in some kind of reality. If the spaces that you build are too far out there, users are going to get lost. So at least initially, it really helps to build worlds that echo and reflect more common realities that people are used to. Here we have actually the world's very first virtual escalator. We've got steps that you go bouncing ever so subtly up and down as you move across them. We've also included a water fountain with audio, where the closer you get to the fountain, the louder the sound is, much as it would be in real life. We've got people in the space that don't do anything except provide a sense of scale to allow you to have a sense of how big this room, this virtual room, actually is. There are lots of things that we can't do in a virtual environment, at least not yet. We can't have users feel the heat of the sun beating down on them, or smell the grass, or feel the wind blowing across their faces. There are compensations. There are other things that we can do that you can't do in the real world. For example, we can have users representing themselves with their virtual identities, their avatars, to other folks all across the world instantaneously with the click of a button or the movement of their mouse.
The great thing about being a god is that you can play around with the basic physics of the world.
One of the constraints that's lifted from us that does exist in real architecture is having valid three-dimensional spaces. For example, in the hub of World's Chat, if you walk around, you can keep going down 4 sets of stairs and end up back where you started without ever going up any stairs at all. So we can do things like have a room that's much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, or have doorways that you can't see from the back but can only see from the front, or have escalators that go in both directions at the same time. There's lots of ways we can bend and stretch reality in order to get more mileage out of this new medium.
The attraction to the gods, of course, is this is fun to imagine how the people and little creatures down there are going to respond, but also vice versa. Humans playing in these kinds of world experience a new world that's very different from their normal existence, and this can be a great attraction to bored human beings working in offices.
You know, there's this funny phenomenon when you're designing virtual reality for adults that the first thing they think of doing is rebuilding the existing reality. And they often pick the most banal parts of reality also. They say, well, let's build a shopping mall. So there's this wonderful freedom that you have when you're designing something where you say this is for kids, and the kids won't stand back there and say, well, I don't know about this, this isn't, how do I navigate through this space, this isn't real. See, the first thing that we see when we come into this world is this avatar that Connor, and I think 7-year-old or 8-year-old boy, drew for us. We asked him to draw himself from the front and back, and it turns out that from the back he's just standing there. From the front he lifts his arm and waves. And quite without knowing it, he has created a small animation. When you go past this avatar, all of a sudden it'll turn around and wave at you. The interesting thing is that they're used to dealing with animals, with stuffed animals, with cartoon characters, and identifying with them. And you see this very much in the space. They're very much attracted to the bear strutting around, going about his business, and the dinosaur scuttling off, doing very sort of curious and mysterious things. As we get closer to the waterfall, you can hear the sound of the water getting louder and louder. And for me at least, it's always a feeling of really being in the water and being surrounded by this completely wild water pixels and water noise.
America has a fascination with real, the unreal, and something in between the two called the hyperreal. And we have a fascination with faking and simulating things to such an extent that they have their own life, and we begin to think of them as something in their own right worth going to, visiting, taking, or buying.
My name's Sadie Plant. I write and teach in the area of cybernetic culture, and I'm going to show you some of my favourite places on the web. Well, I think clearly as a largely informal network of communication, a lot of already existing informal networks, perhaps things that were slightly underground or would be regarded as the alternative as opposed to mainstream culture, have found a natural home on the net. The two have really converged in very interesting ways. Well, here is the Cyberqueer Lounge. This is one of several now queer sites on the net, a lot of which don't get much publicity not on the net, so it's quite a good thing to show. But from here you can, for example, get information on gay pride, new government legislation, and so this is a good example of the sort of density of information that you get. Okay, well we're now in the depths of a whole series of websites around the theme of transgendered identities that's really, I think, been allowed to flourish on the web in a way that it hadn't been allowed to flourish in the pre-web world. This is some pages done by Mediamatic, which is a Dutch magazine looking at the sort of cultural implications of new technologies generally. This is from the 1994 conference held in Amsterdam, and here we have speakers. So we could just click on here, and in a matter of seconds we get Manuel de Landa. Okay, so here we have the Electronic Frontier Foundation page. The EFF are an organisation dedicated to promoting the possibilities of free expression and privacy and civil rights, basically, on the web. Oh, and here we've got to click this button to change the world, so we have to do that. And here are membership information. This is a good case of the pragmatism of the net. Quite simply, you want to change the world, here's something you can do.
This is the Reality Center, a spectacular wraparound cinema created by the computer company Silicon Graphics to show off its hardware. What you see on the screen, however, is no movie. It's a picture of a virtual space which I can navigate around using a joystick, with the computer creating a picture of what I would see from my point of view, as though I'm actually there. It creates, in other words, a sort of virtual reality. Now, there's as much debate about the definition of virtual reality as there is hype. For some, it's enough to paint a picture on the inside of a lampshade and stick it on your head. Others insist on the full immersive experience of a headset and a bodysuit. Either way, virtual reality has never really hit home. It's never been part of the personal computing revolution created by the Macintosh interface or the World Wide Web. Not, that is, until now. The first sign of what might be called desktop virtual reality came from Apple. It's called QuickTime VR. The VR tag for the product probably earned Apple a fatwa from the fundamentalist cybernauts, but the idea is without question one of the most effective ways of using an ordinary desktop computer to explore a three-dimensional world. QuickTime VR is what they used to call a navigatable movie. The principle is simple. You take a series of snapshots of a place or thing from different angles. The QuickTime VR software then stitches them together to create a 3D representation that can be examined from different points of view. It certainly isn't virtual reality. What you see is actual reality, only presented in a new form, and you don't need to insert your head into a Flymo-shaped headset to experience it. But it is virtual in the sense that you can use it to explore places and things that aren't really there. It could be your home on the last day you lived in it, a treasured possession, outer space, the reality center. Navigatable movies are really designed to provide a new way of looking at the real world. The technology that promises to bring a computer-simulated world to the desktop is the Virtual Reality Modeling Language, or VRML. This is a language for creating models of spaces and objects, the same sorts of models that are displayed on the Reality Center screen. VRML is designed to be used in conjunction with the World Wide Web. You don't just have the ability to explore 3D virtual spaces, the objects you find there are hot. When you touch them, they take you to other websites or other VRML spaces. In other words, the World Wide Web is no longer flat. In the opening program of the series, I tried to build a home page using the language of the World Wide Web, HTML. Well, now using VRML, I'm going to bring you the whole house, or at least a room of it. To do that, I need a tool that will build 3D computer models of the room and the objects that furnish it. I'm going to use a new product called Easy3D, which only runs on Silicon Graphics computers. VRML toolkits for the PC are not yet available. With Easy3D, I can create simple objects like spheres and cubes and inspect them from different angles. I can use these as the basic building blocks for the objects in my front room. An elongated cube becomes a table leg. Some things are trickier, the postbox for example. To build this, I'm going to use the Potter's tool. This allows me to create the profile and cross-section of more complex objects. The program then automatically generates the 3D object, which I can then refine and colour to produce the finished result. So let's add a few more objects: a little toy house, a couple of books, a music stand, a coffee mug. Now I can start to make them hot. I simply pick one out and type in a new World Wide Web location. The globe to a satellite image of the Earth, for example. Or it might be another VRML scene. I've built my room, but how can others explore it? By using a 3D browser. There are several around, but perhaps the best known is WebSpace. If you click on a link in a web page that points to a 3D scene, you're sent a file full of VRML code, which specifies the shape and colour of the objects the scene contains. WebSpace then rebuilds the scene on your computer so that you can explore it either by steering a scooter-style handlebar or with a trackball, which allows you to inspect a particular object from different points of view. WebSpace may have brought the third dimension to the desktop, but those who expect to find Jurassic Park are going to be very disappointed. This is hardly virtual reality, more virtual Legoland. The models are made out of simple building blocks and painted in primary colours. You could make things more realistic by adding textures, a wood finish to a table for example. You could make the objects more complex, but both of these things make the models slower to download and manipulate. You no longer float through the scene, you wade through it. The limitation is simply computing power. It takes a machine costing at least £100,000 to generate a virtual space like this. The good news is that with prices falling at their current rate, you too could have a reality centre on your desktop or even your TV screen in 5 years. It'll take a little longer to get a fully rendered 3D version of a scene as good as this one.
The bright, blessed day, the dark, sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
For more information about internet access providers and details of a BBC educational video about the internet, send a large stamped addressed envelope to The Net, PO Box 7, London W5 2GQ. This is the last programme in the current series of The Net, so we'd like to thank all those viewers who took the trouble to contribute their ideas and thoughts, whether by email or internet relay chat, or by more traditional methods. And don't forget, our website will continue to be online for a few more weeks yet. And finally, from The Net.
Hello and welcome to Micro Live. Tonight, computer games. Well, that was Micro Live, and indeed it was live, right up to the minute, showing absolutely the up-to-date technology of that time. And we used to say if cars had improved in power performance, price performance as much as computers had, then today you'd have the disposable motor car. Well, I've got an IBM PC. It's a multimedia with compact disc on it, and I use it a lot for internet, for communicating worldwide with people, particularly on climbing matters. Hello and welcome to Micro Live.